Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and this is part 3 of a series of 4 episodes on how to engage another person's story. In parts 1 and 2, we looked at 7 principles to keep in mind when you're engaging someone's story. And today, we begin to look at the tactics of story engagement. In other words, very specific things that you need to do as you are engaging someone's story. And I want to share 12 tactics. Let me apologize ahead of time. We're going to move fast so that we can get through them all. And each one of them really deserves more explanation than I have time for. The second thing to keep in mind is that there is no way to do all 12 of these things in, for example, an hour of engaging someone's story. There's just no way to do all 12 of these at any one given time. These are 12 tactics that I want you to consider employing over time as you're engaging with someone about their story. So think of it as a tool belt, and you can pull out 1 or 2 of these tactics, 1 or 2 of these tools each time you sit with somebody and listen to their story and engage with their story. Okay, tactic number 1. Explore the trauma before the trauma. The trauma before the trauma. Now, what is the trauma before the trauma? Okay, well, suppose the storyteller has shared a story of when she was sexually abused by her grandfather. The trauma proper is the sexual abuse, but the trauma before the trauma is the setup by her parents for the sexual abuse. So the trauma before the trauma refers to family of origin developmental trauma. Developmental trauma simply means that your developmental needs were not met by your parents, by your primary caregivers in your family of origin. Now, what were your developmental needs? What do I mean by that? Well, as a child, you needed 6 things from your parents. I call these 6 things the big 6. And here they are. You needed your parents to be attuned to you, responsive to you, engaged with you, able to regulate your affect, strong enough to handle your big emotions, and willing to repair harm when they did harm. Those are the 6 things that every child needed from their parents when they were growing up. Now, the storyteller likewise needed these 6 things from his or her parents. If the storyteller did not receive a sufficient amount of these 6 things, then that storyteller has experienced some measure of developmental trauma. If you want an in-depth explanation of the Big 6, you can go back and listen to podcast episode 2, in which I define them in detail. To explore the trauma before the trauma, what it means is exploring the degree to which the storyteller received these 6 things from their parents. Now, here's the critical question. Why is it necessary to explore the trauma before the trauma? For example, if the storyteller has brought you a story about being sexually abused by their grandfather, why is it necessary to know something about the storyteller's parents? Their parents didn't sexually abuse them, Grandpa did. So why do you need to understand the storyteller's relationship with mom and dad? And here's the reason. Because if you don't explore the trauma before the trauma, if you don't name the setup for the sexual abuse, then the storyteller will be bound to shame because they know that they were complicit in the sexual abuse. And I'll talk more about complicity later. Don't worry about it for now. It's coming. But until you help the storyteller see that their grandfather, who sexually abused them, was actually a kinder, more attuned, more responsive, more caring parent than their parents, the storyteller won't have that aha moment of course I kept going back to my grandfather's house. By exploring the trauma before the trauma, you help the storyteller see the immense relational hunger and neediness of herself as a girl. And this, in turn, gives her a coherent understanding of why she kept going back to her sexually abusive grandfather. And all of what I'm saying applies even if the story is not about sexual abuse. I'm just using sexual abuse as an example. Suppose the story, for another example, suppose the story is about a boy who is ruthlessly mocked, terrorized, and beat up by his older brother. In this case, the abuser is a sibling, not a grandfather, and it's not sexual abuse. You still have to explore the trauma before the trauma. You have to help the storyteller name what is going on with mom and dad that they allowed their son to be terrorized by his older brother. Remember, there is always a reason for human behavior. The storyteller would say to mom, Billy hit me, or Billy put a beanbag on top of me and I couldn't breathe and sat on me and I was suffocating. And mom would respond with, you two need to work that out for yourselves. The storyteller will not understand their story until you put language to the trauma before the trauma, namely, the willingness of the mother to turn a blind eye to the fact that her son was being terrorized by his older brother. So, tactic number 1 is explore the trauma before the trauma. This gets at the big six. The big six needs. Was there sufficient attunement, responsiveness, and engagement from the parents on a regular basis? Who provided affect regulation for the storyteller growing up? Was the storyteller allowed to experience and express the so-called negative emotions, sadness, fear, and especially anger? And was there repair from mom and dad when harm was done? Effective story engagement will follow a progression. You have to explore family of origin developmental trauma before you talk about the sexual abuse from their cousin. Let's say that the story they brought is about sexual abuse from a cousin at age 11. That's the story, and you've just heard it. They've read it to you. Okay, look, you are going to be tempted to begin by talking about the sexual abuse from the cousin. Don't do it. First, you have to put language to how the storyteller was set up for the abuse by their parents. And developmental trauma is the setup for abuse. The setup is often worse than the abuse. Developmental trauma creates the hunger to be seen, noticed, paid attention to, all the things that abusers capitalize on. So, tactic number 1, when you're engaging someone's story, is to put language to the trauma before the trauma. That is, the developmental trauma of not getting your big six needs met, which set you up for later abuse. Tactic 2, explore triangulation. Oh my gosh, it is hard to overstate the importance of naming triangulation in the storyteller's family. Now, what is triangulation? Well, imagine a triangle in your mind's eye in which 2 points are at the top, so that the pointy part of the triangle is at the bottom. 2 points are at the top of the triangle, 1 point's at the bottom. The 2 points at the top represent your mom and your dad. The point at the bottom represents you. Now, the closeness of the points of the triangle represent the emotional closeness of the relationship. So a healthy triangle means that mom and dad at the top are closer to each other than either one of them is to you, the child. What did your triangle look like growing up? Just draw your triangle in your mind. Imagine it in your mind's eye. so that the closeness of the points of the triangle represent the closeness, the emotional closeness of the relationships. In my triangle, the line connecting me to my mother was much shorter than the line connecting my mother to my father. And what that means, what that represents, is that my mother was emotionally closer to me than she was to my dad, her husband. Whenever a parent is emotionally closer to one of the children than the parent is to their spouse, that child is being triangulated. And triangulation results in two deadly dynamics. Dynamic number one, your goodness, what you offer in the world, your goodness, your presence is consumed by one of your parents, usually the opposite sex parent, though not always. Dynamic number two, as a result, you are set up to be envied by your same-sex parent. You are put at enmity with your same-sex parent. So in my story, my goodness was consumed by my mother. She looked to me for emotional support and connection and companionship instead of looking to my father, her husband. My mom was emotionally much closer to me than she was to my father. But what do you think my father felt about the fact that his wife preferred me over him? He felt envy. Of course he felt envy. He came to envy me. This is the drama of triangulation. There is always a reason that the storyteller is closer to one parent and more distant from the other parent. And you need to understand what that reason is. Now, this isn't the case for everybody, but for those of you who were triangulated, there is a reason that you were closer to one parent and more distant from the other parent. And this is the essential drama of your childhood. Triangulation, if you were triangulated, that triangulation is the core drama of your childhood. If the storyteller's parents were not committed to regularly talking about their relationship and taking responsibility for how they were harming each other and talking through conflict, if the parents didn't have a deep emotional connection, then the storyteller or one of their siblings was triangulated. It's inevitable. Triangulation means that mom becomes closer to one of the children than mom is to dad. Or dad becomes closer to one of the children than dad is to mom. So your father may have began to look to you to fill his needs because his wife was not there for him. Or your mom began to look to you to connect with her emotionally because her husband was not there for her. The essential drama for many, many people in their childhood was that they were required to be a surrogate spouse to one parent, which set them up to be envied and hated by the other parent. If there is a failure with your mother and father in regards to love, if they are not closely connected and in a deep, rich, meaningful relationship, there will be triangulation. When there is a failure of attunement between mom and dad will need to look somewhere for attunement because people need attunement. So, who did your mother get that attunement through? Who did your father get that attunement from? It will be gotten through you or one of your siblings. Let me just give two examples. Suppose the storyteller is a man who has just shared a story about how his dad would frequently criticize him at family gatherings because this man was into art and dad was into sports. And so dad mocked his son about his artistic pursuits. In order to effectively engage this man's story, you have to do the detective work to uncover why his dad mocked and humiliated him. On the surface, it looks like it's simply because dad was into sports and he thought, artists were kind of inferior. And so his dad, would mock his son because his son was artistic and wasn't into sports. That's the surface explanation. The reality, the deeper reality, however, is that the storyteller's mom had groomed him to be a surrogate spouse to her. Mom preferred her son's emotional support to the emotional support of her husband, which was non-existent. So the son has been triangulated by mom. Here's the point. There is a reason that the storyteller's father has so much contempt for his son, the storyteller. Okay, the person who's read you this story, they likely have already named that their father is cruel. Like they've probably already put language to that. But what they likely haven't named is that they were triangulated by mom and therefore set up by mom to be a live-in rival to dad. This was how mom got back at dad for being emotionally withdrawn from her, from being distant. The storyteller needs you to help him name the triangulation with mom. His story is not going to make coherent sense until he understands why dad was always so cruel to him and contemptuous and would publicly humiliate him. The storyteller cannot access grief or rage until he is able to look at his story with his eyes wide open, which means having his eyes wide open to the triangulation and the covert sexual abuse with mom. All right, second example. A woman tells you a story about her neglectful mother who was often withdrawn and rarely provided any mothering. All right, that's the story that she's brought. It's about her and her mom, and mom comes across as neglectful, withdrawn, emotionally distant. The storyteller thinks that the primary cause of her pain in life is the neglect of her mother. Since mom was such an absent parent, the storyteller feels like her dad was the only good parent she had. But what the storyteller hasn't named is that dad often turned to her, his daughter, for emotional support and connection. In time, dad looked to his daughter as a surrogate spouse because he preferred his daughter's company to his wife's company. All right, the daughter, the woman you're working with, she needs you to name the triangulation with dad. And this will devastate her because she has put dad on a pedestal as the good parent, understandably. But naming the triangulation will also allow her story to finally make sense, which in turn will midwife her into deeper grief and deeper rage. Now, look, the storyteller may not have been the triangulated child. All right, not everyone is triangulated. That burden of triangulation may have fallen to the storyteller's older sibling, for example. However, you still have to do the work of naming the triangulation in the family because the storyteller, in this case, needs to understand why they have felt unchosen all of their life. They need to understand why they have always felt second place to their older sibling who got all the attention. So, tactic number 2 of effective story engagement is to explore triangulation. And if you want a much more comprehensive explanation of triangulation, I explain it in detail in podcast episode 37, and you can go back and listen to episode 37. All right, tactic 3. And I told you we're moving fast through these. Ask provocative questions. Now, there are 2 kinds of questions that you might want to ask. Questions that you know the answer to, and questions that you don't know the answer to. You want to become skilled at using both. Now, let's start with questions that you don't know the answer to. The purpose, this is going to sound odd, the purpose of questions that you don't know the answer to is not to get more information from the storyteller. You don't want to ask questions that take the storyteller out of their heart and into their head. Questions like, how many siblings did you have? Or how old were you when your parents got divorced? The purpose of questions you don't know the answer to is to explore hunches that you have. Specifically, hunches that you have about attachment, about the big six, about triangulation, and the like. And the questions need to be related to the particularity of the story you have just heard. So suppose you've heard a story from a man in which the man's dad berates him for spending so much money on a gift for mom. So this man has spent, a lot of his hard-earned money as an adolescent on a gift for his mother. And the dad in the story insists that his son isn't learning proper money management skills. And that's the charge, that's the energy behind his contempt. Now, you have a hunch that dad's anger is not so much about his son's, inability to handle finances. And it's far more about dad's envy of his son's relationship with mom. You have to figure out if your hunch is accurate. So, stay in the story. Don't go outside the story. Stay in the story and ask a question like, do you have any sense of why your father was that angry about the fact that you spent $50 on a present for mom? I mean, it's not like you hit your mother. You just bought her a gift. Why might your dad be so angry about that? Now, you don't know the answer to this question, but you have a hunch. And you are asking a question to determine if your hunch is accurate. Now, the second kind of question that is good to use, and I know this might sound odd, is a question that you know the answer to. And of course, this isn't really a question, okay? It's a statement disguised as a question. For example, I do this all the time. For example, suppose the storyteller has just told you a story about medical trauma that she went through as a girl, and as a result of her medical treatment, she would throw up on a regular basis. She would have to go to the bathroom and vomit, and it happened frequently. Now, you know that this young girl was not well cared for by her parents. You already know that. She's already shared that with you, and you know that she actually has far more pain about how deeply she was neglected by her parents than she does about her medical trauma. But the story she's brought to you is about throwing up in the bathroom. So what do you say to her? Your task is to be with this girl in the bathroom as she is throwing up. She's 7. You have to get into the particularity of the story. So stand next to her in the bathroom and watch. What do you see? She's alone, of course. She's 7, and her parents don't care that she's throwing up. So picture a 7-year-old girl throwing up alone. What do you see? She has to hold her own hair back. Can you see that? Instead of asking, was anyone with that 7-year-old in the bathroom? All right, that's a question, but there is a more provocative question. And that would be, who held your hair? Now you know the answer to the question. It's not really a question. You are provoking her in the best sense of the word. You are using language that gets her closer to the torment of the 7-year-old in the story. So tactic 3 is ask provocative questions. Sometimes questions you know the answer to, sometimes questions you don't know the answer to, but questions that are provocative and that keep the person in the story or even bring them closer to the boy or girl in the story. All right, tactic 4. Invite the storyteller to be embodied as they are engaging with you. What does this mean? Invite the storyteller to get connected to the physical sensations in their body as they are engaging with you. That is, what sensations are they feeling from their neck down? Now, how do you do this? Well, you can ask them, as you picture that little girl holding her own hair, what do you feel in your body right now? And you might have to get more specific. What sensations are you feeling in your stomach right now? As you tell me this story about the girl throwing up, what sensations are you feeling in your chest, in your throat? Do you have any strong sensations in your body? Just scan your body. Now, suppose that this woman that you're engaging with responds with, yeah, I feel a tightness in my chest. Your next sentence to her needs to be these 2 words. Notice that. Notice that. These can be 2 of the most powerful words that you say. In fact, the trauma therapist Bessel van der Kolk says that the 2 words he says most often during therapy are notice that. Now, why are these 2 words so important? Because you're inviting the storyteller to actually be in their body, to be with their physical sensations. And then let 30 seconds pass as she simply feels that tightness in her chest. Let a minute pass. Let her feel it. And then you might want to ask, if that tightness in your chest could talk, what would it say? This is a very powerful question. You are inviting the storyteller to let her body speak. Stories are written in the cells of our bodies, the tissues that compose our stomach, chest, heart, throat. Your body knows things that your brain does not. You want the storyteller to be connected to her body. And tactic 4 is to invite the storyteller to be in their body. All right, tactic 5. Name and address these 3 things: betrayal, powerlessness, and ambivalence. Okay, this is a lot. You have to help the storyteller find accurate language for the particular kind of harm they experienced. People are dying for someone to tell them the truth about their lives. If they were betrayed by their father in a particular moment in their story, you need to name this betrayal clearly. You were betrayed by your father in that particular moment. People are dying for someone to tell them, when you were in elementary school, you tried and tried to get your dad to stop being so cruel to your mom, and yet you were powerless to protect your mom. Most people with a history of trauma have experienced some measure of betrayal, of powerlessness, and of ambivalence. If the storyteller did not get their big 6 needs met from their parents, then they have experienced betrayal, period. Because children need attunement from their parents. They need someone to respond to their cries for help. Children need parents who pursue them and find out how 3rd grade is going for them. If these things are absent from the storyteller's home, then the storyteller needs you to name that they were betrayed by their parents. What is betrayal? Betrayal is when someone fails you or deserts you, especially in a time of need. So when you hear a story, look for the betrayal and then help the storyteller name it as betrayal. Next, powerlessness. In his book, The Wounded Heart, Dan Allender outlines 3 areas of powerlessness that most abused people carry in their body. And here are the 3 areas. First, the storyteller was powerless to make their dysfunctional family functional. Powerless to make your family work. Second, the storyteller was powerless to stop the abuse proper. So if you were sexually abused, you were powerless to stop it. And third, the storyteller has been powerless to stop the pain in their adult life. There it is. 3 places of powerlessness that many, many people with a history of trauma are carrying around with them inside. Powerless to make your family functional, powerless to stop the abuse, and powerless to stop the pain in your adult life. Now, very often, someone's story will include a line or two in which you watch that boy or girl in the story trying to make their family better. They say or do something because they are trying to make their family more peaceful, more healthy, more functional. Name this with them. Name this with them, and then ask them, was that 8-year-old successful at calming mom down after dad humiliated her again? And the answer, of course, will be yes and no. Yes and no. The 8-year-old was partially successful and partially not. The storyteller needs to feel the agony of the powerlessness that they experienced because they couldn't heal mom's pain. They couldn't fix mom's world, which means they couldn't fix their world, their family. All right, that's powerless. Now, ambivalence. Ambivalence is one of the harder concepts to grasp. Ambivalence is feeling 2 contradictory emotions at the same time. For example, during sexual abuse, you will feel both pleasure and terror. You will feel both good feelings and horrible feelings. That's ambivalence. 2 contradictory emotions at the same time. So suppose a woman tells you a story of driving to her dad's house to see him because her parents are divorced and it's her weekend to be with dad, and so she's driving to dad's house. And in the story, she writes, "As I drove up the driveway, I was excited to see my dad, but I also felt a pit in my stomach." That's a sentence from the story. Do you see the ambivalence there? She is drawn to dad and she is repulsed by dad, both at the same time. As I drove up the driveway, I was excited to see my dad and I also felt a pit in my stomach. Now, why is it so important to name that ambivalence? Because there is always a reason for ambivalence. Why is this 16-year-old girl both excited to see her dad and nauseous about seeing him? And both parts are important. You need to explore how the father has worked to stir excitement in his daughter. There's a reason she's excited as she drives up the driveway. This tells you her excitement, her eagerness to see dad tells you that her story with her dad includes moments of immense goodness with him. All right, if her dad was cruel all the time, she wouldn't feel the excitement as she drives up the driveway. But conversely, you need to explore the pit in her stomach. What 16-year-old feels a pit in her stomach driving into her dad's driveway? Right? There's a reason for the pit in her stomach. The storyteller's ambivalence makes her feel crazy. That's what ambivalence does. Effective story engagement will relieve them of this feeling of craziness. Now, how? By naming the ambivalence and naming the reasons that the 16-year-old felt two opposite feelings at the same time. When you name ambivalence, when you help someone understand why they felt both pleasure and terror, or why they are presently feeling both drawn to their father and kind of nauseous and nervous about seeing their father, when you help them name and understand their ambivalence, they will experience profound relief. Okay, that's tactic 5. Name and address betrayal, powerlessness, and ambivalence. Those, we're going to stop for today. Those are the first 5 tactics to keep in mind when you are engaging someone's story. To recap, they are explore and name the trauma before the trauma, the setup. Number 2, explore triangulation. Number 3, ask good provocative questions. Number 4, invite the storyteller to be embodied as they are engaging with you. And the fifth tactic that you need to do is name and address betrayal, powerlessness, and ambivalence in the story. Okay, tune in next time for the final 7 tactics that I will explain. 7 more tactics to use when you are engaging someone's story. Thank you so much for listening to this episode.